in the last maybe 10 minutes, I'll try to jump into how I think about schools as important contexts to reduce the impact of this work. I will start off with a massive disclaimer that I am not an educator. I rarely go into schools, and I'm sure lots of people lecture you about what things you should be doing differently. So I am sorry that that happens to you. I will just try to do some translation, and I will partially anchor that work in my experiences with my mother, who was a Philadelphia public school teacher for 40 years, 42 years, in some of the more difficult Philadelphia public schools. And so we always kind of worked in the same spaces, she as an educator, I as a researcher. Related, I think, to one of the questions that was asked earlier, I think it's important to think about the common experiences that are kind of happening with economically marginalized youth. And so first, I think there are often higher levels of threat, trauma, feeling unsafe. And then the other kind of piece is I think about differences in enrichment. And a number of colleagues are kind of thinking about these different dimensions of lived experiences of poverty. Two colleagues, Margaret Sheridan and Katie McLaughlin, are kind of trying to think if the brain is uniquely affected by one of these things versus another in different ways. But I wanted to kind of drill into application and think about kind of confronting trauma, which is often more common in low SES populations. And so I think we can kind of just get right into it, and I can think about some really difficult experiences that happened in my community in the last couple of months, namely the murder of a young black boy named Antoine Rose. Antoine was kind of a local fixture at the skate park and was shot in the back 4 times, running away from police. And this is kind of sadly a common story that I think is just incredibly prevalent these days. And youth in and near Pittsburgh were just incredibly shaken by this loss. Antoine wrote this kind of incredibly touching poem about not wanting to be a statistic. It's definitely something that kind of just is very moving and hard to kind of, I think, come to terms with. And so I think about how common this is and just how many families I work with that talk about, well, there's a drive-by shooting here, there's gunshots here, there's this happening and that happening. And I think we all know that kids are coming through the school doors with a lot of kind of challenge and things on their back that I think we have to, as people working with youth, try to ultimately unpack. It may be difficult to unpack, but I think if we do not kind of at least lean into it, we may eventually be doing them a disservice. So in my area, in Allegheny County, many of the schools tried to give students kind of a space to process that fear, kind of trauma and grief. And most notably, they actually had Antoine's mom, Michelle Kenny, kind of visit a lot of local schools. And I think this was particularly powerful and kind of worked with kids to help them kind of move through that challenge. Obviously, this is not always possible. And there are often lots of traumatic events happening in communities, but I think as the larger and bigger ones kind of rock and grip communities, we must do something. And I think ignoring these, we ignore these at our peril. And we think about kind of the issues that are created in learning and just focus. If you feel like you have a target on your back or your friend or someone you knew was just shot or gunned down, you're not going to give a care about your calculus homework. You're not going to care about what's happening in physics class because you have some real life stuff kind of happening. And I think, again, kind of coming back to our local context and kind of a lot of the events that happened in Ferguson and Michael Brown. And so kind of, I think, again, thinking forwardly about dealing with the things that students are coming through the doors with. And there's obviously many different resources kind of in this space. Folks kind of talked about kind of trauma-informed care and kind of trauma-informed educational perspectives. There's a lot of kind of different resources I could share with the group. The other kind of piece, so it's hard to kind of just then pivot away. There's the kind of, I think, challenges of threat and trauma. Then kind of thinking about kind of enrichment and kind of being mindful of kind of resources and the availability that individuals have. And so there's a really kind of nice report actually from, oddly enough, George Lucas has an educational foundation about how schools can address poverty. And they have kind of some nice kind of, I think, like really pragmatic, reasonable things that they kind of bring in. So they talk about kind of keeping stocks of school supplies and basic, necessities for students who may need them, but kind of finding kind of quiet ways to kind of distribute things. In Pittsburgh, there's been a really common practice of what we call backpack feeding programs, which are that kids that are qualify for free and reduced price lunch during the week can kind of basically kind of mildly raid a food pantry on Friday so that they have food when they go home on the weekends. And these are kind of simple things that many in the community are saying are pretty powerful, just because if you don't have, if you don't have money and you're on free and reduced price lunch at school, what is it like on those 2 days between Friday and Monday? Other things, just kind of being mindful of kind of how we assign work and the kind of necessities of some technology for some work. And this may get a little too social justice-y for some, but I think thinking about kind of classism, environmental pollution, other injustices that are kind of disproportionately kind of affecting economically marginalized youth and giving kind of pathways to action. So I could think easily about kind of curriculum from kind of a science and kind of social science or social studies kind of place where you could look at kind of the levels of pollutants in your local environment, and then kind of think about taking legislative action and writing your legislators and kind of cool curriculum that would be kind of synergistic across areas. The last kind of thing, one of the last couple things, and I'll kind of close hopefully on, I think, a powerful note that is somewhat encouraging, is thinking about kind of building community and kind of the power of role models. So many folks probably have lots of questions about resiliency. So the kind of earliest studies on resiliency by a woman named Emmy Werner in one of the Hawaiian Islands, Kauai, the biggest thing that she found pretty consistently that helped people who are at the margins, young kids at the margins, young kids at risk, kind of buffer and buoy themselves in the face of trauma, tragedy, and stress, was having a kind of adult role model. And often the kids in Kauai pointed to teachers. So I think about how kind of positive relationships are incredibly critical to kind of quote-unquote at-risk youth or youth who are economically marginalized. And this could have kind of, I think, a powerful effect on potential brain development. And we didn't get into it, but there's this kind of notion of what's called a toxic stress response. We've talked a little bit about kind of the chronicity of difficulties, and a lot of times this can start to cause dysregulation in what's called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the axis that's involved with kind of the output of cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone that kind of can, in chronic amounts, kind of cause lots of deleterious things in the brain and the body. And so we found pretty consistently that relationships bolster and buffer against the toxic stress response of cortisol, at least in this kind of chronic form. So kind of thinking about and trying to, this is where you may hate my suggestions, but we'll see. Trying to put this into action. So thinking about kind of policy and thinking about staff turnover. This is obviously harder for folks who are in the classroom. This is much more of an admin kind of place. But thinking about kind of staff turnover, and that's I think the toughest. If kids are just seeing lots of people kind of come through their classroom, it's difficult. And that's, role models are built by multiple positive interactions. In line with that, I'm thinking about kind of continuous time with students. And so having students, for example, kind of in the same homeroom multiple, years in a row. And so I was just at a local school district in the county, and, the teacher that I was working with, in her class, she'd had the students for years, and so she knew everything going on in their lives. She could kind of recite who was in the family and what was happening. And at a point, she was both a social worker and a sister. And I think about how positive of a presence that was for the kids. You can also think about kind of, pedagogically sensitive curriculum that might be kind of relevant and meaningful for kids and kind of can draw on their experiences and kind of connect to role models. One last kind of bit of data to further, I think, cement and maybe motivate people if they weren't. I presume everyone is already kind of doing a lot of this stuff. But I'm going to talk about what are called pro-inflammatory cytokines, which are the regulators of the body's immune response. They help the body kind of respond to pathogenic events or just pathogens in general. Inflammation is generally really bad. We're starting to realize that inflammation is incredibly deleterious and horrible for our lives. Both our mental health and our physical health is really, I think, driven a lot by inflammatory variations and really connected to a lot of things like diabetes, heart attack, stroke. So what we see is, I'm going to show you, SES is on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis is one kind of pro-inflammatory cytokine called interleukin-6. And there'll be two different groups that I'll show, one without supportive role models and one with. And again, it's kind of stratified by SES. For the kids that don't have supportive role models, we see higher levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines in low SES kids. So basically, lower SES kids have higher levels of inflammation, and which is kind of the start of potentially some negative and chronic health issues. However, and this is for kids who don't have supportive role models. If you look at kids who do, kids who have supportive role models, even in low SES contexts, have kind of equivalent or as low kind of pro-inflammatory cytokine levels. And this is work by Edith Chen and Greg Miller that I think is really powerful and interesting. They've really been kind of getting into role models in that space and kind of finding changes in our body's basic physiology impacted by positive experiences. Kind of last thing is just kind of keep reaching out. I applaud all of you for being here. I think it's incredibly kind of cool that you're attending such a potentially quirky talk in the scope of the full agenda. But I'll just kind of highlight that the BrainFacts website has a lot of nice resources for educators. There's always a kind of connect to neuroscientists. And I would kind of argue don't be too shy. Researchers, always, I think, most of us want to have implications and applications to our work. And so recently, I've done a lot of work in a local school district where we're testing kids. And so a month ago, I tested 200 ninth graders, giving them a bunch of surveys about motivation, whether they were interested and excited about math. We also gave them kind of executive functioning tasks that kind of looked at some of these kind of constructs like inhibition and planning that I've talked about already. And it's kind of a university-school partnership where the school is then going to provide outcome data from the kids in terms of their grades and disciplinary issues, stuff like that. And I think we're going to try and piece together this whole puzzle. And then our hope is to find some patterns in the data and then kind of circle back. Even in the simplest form, one could easily think about kids that are high on motivation and low on executive functioning, and kids who are high on executive functioning and low on motivation. And we may have different pedagogical strategies that kind of work and help them succeed for different kinds of class content. And so with that, I'll kind of thank you guys for your kind of attention and kind of open it up to kind of questions and discussion. So.